Family business makes no sense. So let's talk about it.
Welcome to another episode of Family Business Makes No Sense, where I explain why, because the concepts of family and business are so naturally oppositional, they inevitably lead to conflict at some time for just about every family business. And today we're going to be talking about one of those many common causes of conflict: broken promises and unmet expectations. We find these in a lot of the families that we work with that have basically descended into conflict. Most importantly, we're not just going to unpack what broken promises and unmet expectations are so they can be spotted and prevented more easily. We are going to talk about what can you do about them to avoid them happening in the first place and to minimize their impact if they do arise. I'm Jon Kenfield, the Family Business Solutionist, broadcasting from Melbourne in Australia. I've been working with families in business in conflict for a great many years. And one of the main things that I've learned is that the vast majority of family business conflicts are a result of relational problems, not the financial issues that are often presented as the cause of that conflict. On that basis, it's my firm belief that an empathic problem-solving approach to conflict is almost always going to be more effective and less destructive and less expensive than a logical, threat-based form of emotion control or emotional blackmail. Provided we understand why these causes of conflict arise, and specifically today we understand why broken promises and unmet expectations will lead to conflict, we are able to create better prevention strategies, and if we haven't had those strategies in place, better responses to the conflicts that have arisen so we can resolve them more effectively. If that's of interest to you, please listen on. Let's start by defining what we mean, because broken promises and unmet expectations sound a bit similar. Well, for our purposes, as conflict resolvers, they're quite different. Broken promises relate to what are perceived to be dishonest and unfair treatment meted out to family members, usually by people who should know better and who are in a position of power and respect and, at least at some point in time, very high trust. Now, when those people are exposed or seen or finally appreciated as not people of their word, people who do not stick to promises that they have made, often many, many times and often over a long period of time, it shakes the very foundations of the recipient's faith in people, family, work, selves. Essentially, it shakes their entire world picture. And one of the things that compounds our problem is that we naturally assume that because we have the word family in our family business moniker, that we must be operating in an environment of unconditional love, nurture, respect, affection, and so forth, where the reality is that a great many family businesses are realistically the very opposite of that. They are, in many cases, very, very closely modelled on the character, personality, and values and beliefs of charismatic leaders and business owners who may be traditionalists, who rely on hierarchical, old-fashioned hierarchical systems of control, Or they may be entrepreneurs who basically couldn't give a damn about anything much other than moving faster than anybody else to make money. And both types of individual, even though in some ways they're at opposite ends of a scale of respectability, predictability, modernity, and so on, they produce very similar outcomes. The impact they have on their families tends to produce one of three types of person. Now we're relating this into family business. There are other family members who just don't get sucked into the whole family business vortex, and so they're outside of this definition. But if family members, next generation family members, have been sucked into the family business orbit, they will often develop into one of three types over time. The first type are the rebels. And the rebels are the ones who are in constant competition with their parents, usually son to father, daughter to mother, rarely cross-gender, but it happens. It's very much the old bull, young bull type environment, and that applies to both males and females, interestingly. Now, the rebels are usually people who are at least as capable as the parents, who they constantly challenge. And because the parents are like in the animal kingdom, they're not prepared to step aside because they're highly competitive and control-oriented individuals. They force the rebellious next generation to either mount a coup and topple them, or they force them to leave the business, and we quite often see them setting up in another business because the nature of the business is really all they've been prepared for in life. They often go into competition with their own family by setting up a new business, frequently backed by people who have no great affiliation to the existing regime and are happy to back next generation to acquire a lot of the intellectual property and inside dirt to topple, in a competitive sense, an old competitor. After the rebels, we have the resenters. Now, the rebels are competent individuals. They have other options. They're not given their space in the business, so they go and make their own space in the world. The resenters are the ones who have lower capability. They don't necessarily recognize their own lack of capability, and they are very easily seduced by the promises of one day my son or my daughter, this will all be yours, as a way of achieving a higher status and better remuneration in life than they could probably achieve based on their own talents and resources. So they tend to hang in place until they perceive they're about to be forced out of the business, perhaps by some proper objective management restructure, push from senior staff, pushes from advisors who are saying, these guys really aren't up to it. And they will often leave the business bitter and twisted with resentment against the parents who didn't keep their promises to look after them. And they've relied on those promises rather than develop their own skills and worth over time. These guys may or may not divorce themselves from the family. The rebels we talked about before often basically have very little to do with the family for the rest of their lives. The resenters don't do that, but they are constantly unhappy, uncomfortable, whinging, moaning, and so on. And they create a very unpleasant burr under the saddle in the life of the family and the business for as long as they have any influence on the business. The final category is the submitter, who is the person who may or may not have a high degree of competence, but whatever capability they've got is subservient to their commitment to the parents. And they don't challenge. They often become a little bit like a resenter because their spouses and their friends they're telling them they could be and should be doing so much better than they do, and they allow parents to stay in place often long beyond their rational use-by date. and you get an uncompetitive business ultimately, which often will not result in a happy outcome for the business or its employees or the family that owns it. So there are three types that we get. The indentured family labour is often in place in a family business for the wrong reason, and that is because they are cheaper and it flatters the ego of the parents to have their kids around. If conflict has erupted, there is something very wrong in the mix, and that needs to be investigated. Unmet expectations are different because where we're talking about unmet expectations, we have a more specific focus on family members working in a family business who have an unrealistic understanding and awareness of their own contribution, status, regard from others in the business. And so they are not responding to promises that have been broken, they're responding to unrealistic expectations of entitlements. So they create an emotional construct of how good they are and what they should deserve, which may include imagined promises or inferences about rewards into the future, and these are not justified by any sort of reality. Some of these guys will develop some sort of narcissistic, depressive personality because they're not getting any of the regard that they need from others because they don't deserve it. And so they build an unrealistic self-regard and then project it outwards to others in one of the various forms of narcissistic personality disorder. However you cut and dice it, they're not happy people, and they don't make people around them happy either. So if broken promises and unmet expectations are such a common cause of conflict in family business, what can a family do to try to either prevent the problem from happening in the first place or deal with it and resolve it, or at least diminish it to manageable proportions if it does arise? A strategy that we have found useful many times is what we call the Little Red Book. This is where you take the family on a journey down memory lane, right back into childhood, and you create a list of the benefits by year that each child has received. You create a separate column for each child where you identify the notional value, if a notional value can be ascribed. And as you work your way through childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, right up to the present day, you may move from things like new bicycle to house deposit. You may include things like overseas holidays, gap year funding, first car support, all that sort of thing. What you're doing, though, is getting people's memories out in the open, talking about them, and either confirming them or modifying perspectives. And then you're looking at building a visible picture of what's actually happened within the family over those growing up and developmental years. In most families, the end result is, if not equality, it's equity. It is appropriate to the circumstances and needs of the family at a point in time and its ability to fund those needs. So often a first child will be around when parents are building a business, building a fortune, and there'll be less money in the system to support them. They'll get other benefits at that particular time, but you get the opportunity of saying, well, your first bicycle was out of the op shop. Your first bicycle was, a brand new, bright red, carbon fibre delight, even as a tricycle for a small child. But once you contextualise it in the situation of the family at the time, the resentment about the difference starts to take on a different perspective. So going through an exercise like a red book, which I've got to say the first few times I did it, felt like an insult to everybody's intelligence. But people really get into it, and it creates some fantastic conversations amongst family members, and they remember their childhood through these things, because one person will remember something that stimulates memories of others, and it alters the conversation altogether from resentment, if you manage it properly, to more of a sense of gratitude. If you just put in the fact that wasn't that a good thing, did all of their friends do this well and so on, obviously you got to have some sense of reality. But you can massively change perspectives and ultimately end up either with okay, now we get it and maybe it doesn't matter so much, or you can end up with something that says, yeah, I can see how you did get a major benefit because you got your a house deposit that none of the rest of us got. And the family may then come up with a formula or an equation which settles and satisfies everyone's sense of fairness without it requiring necessarily a big cash payout at that point in time, because that's not really what's going on here. As I said before, it's more about the relationship, the sense of unfairness, than it is usually about the actual hard dollars. Now, the other things that are useful strategies, which we talk about in many, many cases as a best practice mechanism for helping to prevent or avoid conflict, involves creating a formal forum for family members to meet, a place where they spend some time developing a family plan, a place where they meet on a regular basis. It might be annual, it might be quarterly for a dinner or something like that. It can be annual, and the whole family, if it's in a position to do so, goes away for a holiday to celebrate being a family with a business, or just being a family. And they create a plan. Everybody knows what to expect. Everybody knows what their role is in achieving the family's goals. And everyone has a sense of how they'll be rewarded for their participation, because it enables you to create some policies and some ground rules and some understandings to replace the take it for granted because we're all a family attitudes that pervade many families in business who don't recognize the fact that they are a family in business, and they operate their business as though they're still just a family group. And as we've said many times through this series, that really is a pathway to hell. Those are the two main strategies I'd be recommending, and from experience, they can both work. If that sounds like a good idea, have a crack at it yourself or seek some help. We're more than happy to talk stuff through with you and help if we can. And if you found this video helpful, thank you. Please come back for more. We've got another 45 to go in this particular series. And if you know somebody else who may get some benefit from listening to some of the stuff that we're talking about based on several decades of experience of working with family business, please don't be shy about passing on the links and let them know that we exist. That will be much appreciated. For now, I'm Jon Kenfield, the Family Business Solutionist, signing off and saying thanks for watching. Goodbye.